Rathbones Look Forward series.
Hello, I'm Andrea Catherwood and welcome to the Rathbones Look Forward series. We're speaking to some of the great thinkers, journalists and writers of our time, focusing on the future of our changing world. Well, today my guest is Nadine Strossen. She is a professor of constitutional law at the New York Law School, an author, and Nadine was the first woman national president of the American Civil Liberties Union. Her latest book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, explores the rise of offensive speech and how best to counter that. We're talking about the future of free speech. Most people feel like free speech is integral to democracy and something that must surely be defended. And then a lot of people feel very uncomfortable when they hear very challenging speech that's very racist or Islamophobic. And I just wonder, can we defend the right to speak without seemingly defending those viewpoints that we find it very difficult to tolerate?
Absolutely, Andrea, because what we are defending is not the particular viewpoint, but the underlying principle or right, which redounds to the benefit of every viewpoint. And we've discovered throughout history and around the world that once we give government the power to pick and choose certain viewpoints that it deems to be so dangerous that they may not be expressed, or so reviled that they may not be expressed, then that power can boomerang and be used to suppress exactly the opposite viewpoint, one that we might cherish.
Tell me a little bit about this phrase hate speech, because the concept isn't modern, but the use of it is, and I believe that it's one of those words that's slightly changing, because it seems to mean at the moment, particularly on the internet, speech that we hate. And that's not really what hate speech started out as meaning, is it?
Well, in the United States, there is no legal concept of hate speech. The way the term is usually used is to describe speech that in the United Kingdom and most other democratic countries is illegal, sometimes even criminally punishable. That is, views that express hate in terms of certain demographic characteristics, such as race, religion, gender, or so forth. But in fact, you are absolutely correct, Andrea, that people use the term for whatever idea they hate. Yeah. So in the United States, even wearing a cap that says Trump has been attacked as hate speech. On the other hand, people who dislike the advocacy of Black Lives Matter protesters have called that hate speech.
I was fascinated when I read in your book to read about a case. I'm sure it's really well known in the US, but I have to admit that I'd never heard of it before. It's called the Skokie case, and it was back in 1977. Can you just tell us a little bit about it and about the effect that it had? Because it kind of gets to the bottom of this conundrum that many of us face about free speech.
Exactly. It really epitomizes the American view, which many people have heard the statement attributed to Voltaire. I disagree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. That is a principle of free speech law in the United States, and the Skokie case really put it to the test. Skokie involved a group of neo-Nazis who wanted to demonstrate there, and that town it's near Chicago for people who know U.S. geography. It happened to have a large population, not only of Jewish people, but many of them were Holocaust survivors. And even the most diehard free speech supporters said, we want to make one exception to speech that really should not be protected, and it is for this most vile viewpoint. Now, what's really interesting about it, Andrea, is that the organization that defended the free speech rights of the neo-Nazis is the one that I was privileged to head for many years, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which is at the forefront of advocating for racial justice and couldn't disagree more strongly with the substantive message that the Nazis were expressing. But as we pointed out in our briefs in that case, the very same arguments that were being raised to suppress the Nazi speech had also been raised less than 10 years earlier in another town in Illinois called Cicero to try to stop Martin Luther King and other civil rights demonstrators from protesting because their views were hated and even seen as hateful and dangerous in that community.
It is difficult though, isn't it? Because quite a lot of people listen to that and they understand it, and yet they think, but hold on a second, surely we must need to draw a line somewhere. What happens when, people's welfare is involved? What happens when it's an actual risk of violence? And, we've seen what's happened, unfortunately, tragically, in Charlottesville.
But that was not directly caused by the speech itself. And the U.S. law draws what I think is a completely sensible line, and I would advocate it around the world, at least in democratic countries, and that is government may never punish speech merely because the viewpoint is reviled, no matter how deeply, no matter how widely, but government may suppress speech if, but only if, the speech directly causes imminent, serious, specific harm, such as a true threat that really puts people in fear that they're going to be subject to an attack. It is not just that I think this is a dangerous idea that might ultimately perhaps lead to a negative policy, because once you give the government that much power, any challenge to the status quo can be seen as dangerous. Civil rights demonstrators in the United States were seen as dangerous and were suppressed under that looser rationale.
So when you've got views that are abhorrent to a vast majority of the population, I think many people feel one reason to suppress them is because maybe more vulnerable people, young people, could be influenced by them, that those views have some traction. We'd like to think that nobody would pay any attention to them, but we feel that that may not be true. And we kind of look back to, the 1930s Germany, and we say, well, hold on, if people are allowed to say things that we consider to be abhorrent or we consider to be difficult or dangerous, it can work. People can follow them. Would you agree that that is a possible risk? But it's a risk worth taking?
It certainly is a risk, but we have actual history demonstrating that it is far from risk-free to censor. That is at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive, including in pre-Nazi Germany, where there actually were hate speech laws that were very strictly enforced, including against leading Nazis, including Julius Streicher, who was the publisher of a virulently anti-Semitic magazine, Der Stürmer. They served time in prison, and guess what? They loved it. They got so much attention and so much publicity that they otherwise would not have received. They gained sympathy, they became free speech martyrs, and that is exactly why alt-right provocateurs follow the same strategy in the United States today. They love it when people try to silence them. They get attention they otherwise never would have had.
Well, I mean, that's been happening, actually, quite worryingly, on American college campuses. For years, I think many people have been complaining that, what happened to all that activism that we saw in America, right? And all these college students, they're now just worried about getting a good degree, making money. Suddenly you're seeing a resurgence of this, which in one way is very heartening, but in another way, we're looking at a situation where, for example, the head of Breitbart, the right-wing news organisation, I think he went to Berkeley, didn't he?
Yes.
And he was banned. How do you feel about that kind of thing, where actually universities are saying, look, enough, we're not having them here?
It breaks my heart, because I was one of those student demonstrators in the 60s and 70s who was so happy to see this resurgence of activism after many decades of apathy in support of social justice causes and human rights. But what was really disheartening was the extent to which these students believe wrongly that freedom of speech is their enemy rather than what I know it to be, their time-tested and essential ally. I think they're very short-sighted because they live in a community where they're surrounded by people who share their values. And so they naively assume that, if we empower the university officials to suppress speech that is seen as hateful, it's going to be the ideas that we think are hateful that will be suppressed. Well, I say one of the good things about Donald Trump is he's serving a very educational function when he says, I would like to deport people who burn the American flag. I think that athletes, African-American athletes who are taking the knee to protest racial injustice should be punished. So this is where the political power, they would suppress messages that these college students would think should be protected.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about minorities, because there's an argument that minorities ought to be more protected. They suffer the most, and therefore any kind of hate speech against minorities is when we should be stepping in. Somebody should be stepping in, the government, I guess, and protecting those minorities. Do you also believe that there's a reason that that's not the case?
Yes. So I do agree with you that somebody should be stepping in. And in my view, it should not be the government. It should be civil society, and all of us who are committed to racial justice and equality and dignity should have an obligation to speak out against discrimination. Government can do and should do this, Andrea. Government should enforce very strongly laws against discrimination, actual discriminatory conduct in employment and housing and voting, education, and so forth. Government should also strongly prosecute crimes, discriminatory crimes that are committed against minority people. And for the rest of us, we should not only raise our voices to protest hateful and discriminatory ideas, but we should do everything possible to support members of minority groups themselves to have the resources and the abilities and the confidence to do that themselves. And that is happening in the United States, including among minority college students. They are speaking up on their own behalfs, and that is far more empowering than having the government, quote unquote, protect them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, when you bring in hate speech laws, they have to be brought in by the government. Mm-hmm. You know, the government end up being the people that decide what is hate and what isn't. That, from everything that you're saying, and indeed from your book, appears to be very counterproductive in the long run.
Exactly. And I should stress here in the UK that I give so many examples from your country, from other European countries, from Canada, Australia, all of these democracies that have hate speech laws. The human rights activists are increasingly complaining that no matter how well intended these laws were, they're actually consistently being used disproportionately to suppress minority voices themselves. And we shouldn't be surprised, because the government is acting at the behest of the majority of the power elite. Of course, it's not going to use that very subjective power to suppress government critics and those who are advocating law reform.
We've touched on Donald Trump before, but I'd like to ask you about what effect you feel he has on the rise of hate. Looking at this from this side of the Atlantic, I think many people would feel that there has been a real upsurgence of hate in the US. Is that fair, or is that coloured by what we're seeing in the media?
I think it's fair, with one caveat, that it's notoriously difficult to get complete statistics because not everybody reports every incident of hateful speech. Suffice it to make two observations. Number one, there are definitely far too many reported incidents, including on college campuses. And number two, all the experts agree that when somebody in a position of authority gives permission, so to speak, to express certain hateful ideas, that they tend to increase because they assume they can get away with that with impunity. I would say even beyond hateful ideas, there's also so-called hate crimes, when people are singling out victims of assaults and vandalism on the basis of discrimination against religious minorities or racial minorities.
How much of it would you attribute to the way that Donald Trump ran his campaign and to what he's done in his first time in office?
He certainly has used a lot of hateful rhetoric. He certainly has engaged in and advocated and spearheaded a lot of discriminatory policies. Now, I have to say, as an activist, I always see the glass half full rather than glass half empty. He definitely has galvanized a pushback. So we also have record numbers of citizens of all ages all across the country, including college students, who are mobilizing constantly to not only denounce his hateful and discriminatory ideas, but to actually organize and engage in activism to counteract them.
I'd like to move on now to talk more broadly about free speech. You know, we've seen a rise in populism across Europe, and at the same time, certainly we feel in Europe that we've seen a perceived rise in the far right in the US. You know, from Breitbart news organisation to the events in Charlottesville. There is an argument that publishing the views of the far right allows these ideas to flourish in the air, and it can lead directly to much wider violence. I'd like to begin this actually by looking backward, if we may, and looking historically and seeing how much of that is really true.
So It's actually a very common sense hypothesis that if somebody hears something hateful, that it will instill hateful ideas, and that might increase the likelihood that they engage in hateful conduct. But it's also a very plausible hypothesis that it will have the opposite effect, because somebody may be revolted by the idea, may debate against it, will persuade somebody else who might have been disposed to accept the idea not to do so. And I think that we have to allow for an open debate. I have confidence not only in the justness of anti-discrimination principles, but also in the decency of most members of our democratic societies, that basically they do support these ideals of liberty and justice for all. We certainly have seen that attempts, and more than attempts, actual punishment of hateful ideas in other societies have not had the desired impact. Nazi Germany, or pre-Nazi Germany, again, being a very important example where hateful speech, including Nazi speech, was censored, and tragically, it did not prevent the rise of Hitlerism. The real problem there was failure to protect against actual violence. So Hitler and his henchmen literally got away with murder. They physically assaulted their political opponents and critics and Jews and Roma and other minorities, and went scot-free. This, by the way, was the same problem we had in Charlottesville. Nobody is arguing that the hateful ideas, abhorrent as they were what directly caused the violent action. In fact, the city of Charlottesville appointed an independent commission to study the awful tragedy there, and their uniform conclusion was that it was the failure of law enforcement. There was not a single police officer in the vicinity where the car ran over Heather Heyer.
I suppose people, although they understand all of that, they worry about the normalization of certain words and phrases that they feel perhaps would not have been permitted or allowed or accepted. Part of this is the rise of the internet, and I'd like to talk more about that later. But you know, sometimes it's because we can post something and we don't have to look someone in the eye and
Can I
saying
give
it.
you a counterexample, Andrea?
Sure.
Because in the United States, we don't have hate speech laws. They've been unconstitutional forever. And interestingly enough, for all of the strong disagreements among Supreme Court justices who are very ideologically polarized, they are unanimous on this point. As I would wish that people across the ideological spectrum would recognize that all of us have a stake in robust free speech. But in the United States, you say a particular word becomes normalized. It's the opposite. The so-called N-word, which literally you cannot say the whole word in any context without risking your political career, without risking all of your friends and social standing, even though there is no government power to punish you. The power of peer pressure and social pressure is so strong that some observers have said social pressure in the United States has actually done more to suppress certain hateful ideas and words than laws have done in other countries.
Very interesting to talk a little bit about social pressure right now, because one of the big news stories recently has been those children who were separated from their parents at the Mexico border. This was Donald Trump's behest to crack down on illegal immigration in the US. But those images obviously went around the world. They were hugely effective, and actually a pressure that wasn't to do with the law necessarily, but perhaps more to do with social pressure, actually made Donald Trump change his mind.
And this is so important because it is the very first time that Donald Trump has backed down on any policy, and it was because of the social pressure, which of course in turn has political consequences. And a lot of the people who put pressure on him were Republicans who have basically been supporting him, but Republican elected officials who feared that they would lose elections or support from their constituents because of the uprise in anger. And it's a perfect demonstration of the real power of speech to combat dangerous, hateful, discriminatory policies.
Now, I must just point out that we're recording this at the beginning of July and the events are moving relatively quickly there, so I'm not sure if there will be a different news story by the time this goes out.
Oh, Trump has never changed his mind on anything.
We've talked a little bit about Charlottesville, and those were those scenes that really shocked the world, the neo-Nazi protest there and indeed the kind of counter-protest against it that led to violence and tragically to death. You've spoken about the clear effect that letting neo-Nazis march had on their next event. I would like you to explain a little bit more about that to our listeners, because actually what happened was that there was a larger protest against the neo-Nazis, wasn't
exactly. Yes. So the counter speech absolutely drowned out in every sense the hateful and abhorrent message. I should say I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and it just gave me chills to hear these people saying Jews will not replace us and brandishing torches and firearms. But the outpouring against that was extraordinary. It included basically every elected official, Republicans, Democrats, with one exception. And when Donald Trump did not sufficiently clearly denounce those hateful views, he received an enormous amount of pushback. Military leaders spoke out, and even members of two business councils that were advising the president, top CEOs of major corporations, not only so strongly denounced those views, but actually disbanded the councils. They didn't want to be associated with him anymore. And at the grassroots level, in communities all across the United States, we saw spontaneous citizens' demonstrations in favor of equality and diversity and inclusivity.
You've made a very compelling argument against stricter laws against free speech. But if people listening are wondering, what then can they do when they are worried, particularly perhaps about dangerous and destructive views that their children might be looking at online or that friends might be hearing? What can we all do to make sure that without these laws in place that actually prevent people from speaking, we're also able to counter those arguments?
Absolutely. And this is a matter of education, and social psychologists have long said that the most effective way to counter prejudice and to foster tolerance and diversity and inclusivity is through affirmative education, accurate information about other individuals, and even more importantly, contact with those groups. It's a reason why integration and affirmative action are so important, because once we know and live with and work with and go to school with the other, whoever that has been, not surprisingly, our negative preconceptions disappear. And what's really interesting, Andrea, since you're part of the media and using your free speech rights and abilities in this very helpful way, that the social psychologists have found that what they call parasocial contact also has a very, very positive impact. So if you see media depictions or descriptions of certain kinds of people, even if you never have any real world interaction with them, you still have a much less discriminatory, much more positive attitude toward them.
So really the idea as well of using the media positively so that people can engage and debate has got to be a better way, even if you really disagree with what they're saying,
so it's
to allow
not,
them on. I mean, this is something,
right.
Again, we in the UK debate this all the time. Should we have people from a very far-right organisation on a mainstream news programme, even if they have views that are abhorrent to a lot of the population? And when we do, for example, at the BBC, there are very often protests outside saying those people shouldn't be given the right to speak. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
My thoughts really go back to John Stuart Mill's famous essay on liberty, which I have seen confirmed by actual experience. And that is, if you hold an idea even really strongly, but you don't subject it to criticism or challenge or question or debate, the idea becomes a dead dogma that doesn't have as rich a meaning to you as when you are confronted with the opposite idea and forced to articulate a response to it. I can give a very recent example from myself. myself, because of the kind of pushback by college students in the United States and others against even the most time-honored free speech principles, I was forced to try to explain to them why free speech is important. I pretty much had been taking that for granted. And I really have a more dynamic, vivid, living appreciation of free speech as a result of these debates.
I'd like to move on now to talk about the thorny issue of religion. Do you feel that we should all have the right to critique and to lampoon and to disrespect religion?
Absolutely. I mean, religion is precisely because it is so important, and because it has so much impact, not only on individual lives, but also on public policy. In the United States, now in early July, we're facing a new Supreme Court appointment, which is probably going to be driven by response to certain religious views that abortion should be illegal. So, of course, we have to be free to critique it. And plus, some wise sage once said, every great truth began as a blasphemy. If we couldn't critique religion, then we would still think that the sun revolves around the earth, right?
Indeed, and in fact, when that was looked at way back then, I think in Italy there were plenty who said that the first people who discovered that wasn't true were actually blaspheming.
Yes.
So this idea then that there is no philosophical or religious premise that shouldn't be immune to scrutiny.
And no atheistic premise either. We want to be neutral. There is no idea beyond challenge. And I would say that's or belief. That's especially important for the ones that are central to individuals in society, because those are the ones that most urgently call for reexamination, either because they might prove to be wrong, or because they become more meaningful and more vital through the process of reexamination. In fact, many Europeans have complained about government support for religion precisely, and these are religious leaders, ministers, members of the clergy, who say religion is less vital in Europe precisely because the government support saps the vitality. In the United States, we have separation of church and state, and yet we're far more religious than European countries which have government-sponsored religion.
I want to go to one particular example, and it was the horrific attack on Charlie Hebdo, which was the French satirical magazine back in 2015. Its staff and a policeman were caught up in the attack. There was a lot of solidarity for the magazine itself. A lot of people had never seen the cartoons within it. Those of us who knew a little bit about it knew that it absolutely lampooned not just the Muslim religion, but all religions in a way that many people, even people who are not particularly religious, would have found offensive. I mean, the way it portrayed the Catholic Church as well was really right out there. And I wonder what you think of the provocative stance of those kind of images, particularly the satirical Muslim images against the Prophet Muhammad, because we, in the media as well, we're very sensitive to this issue because we know the offence that it causes.
So in the United States, you have no right not to be offended. And to the contrary, you have a right to be offensive if it is your idea that is offensive. Of course, if your offensive idea translates into discriminatory conduct, that can and should be punished. But it is very dangerous to say that some ideas will not be debatable in a supposedly free democratic society just because some people will be offended by it. That will eliminate basically all advocacy. I mentioned, for example, the topic of abortion, which I know was very recently debated and voted on in Ireland, and it's very much at the forefront in the United States now, thanks to the change in the Supreme Court. Some people who believe that the life begins at the moment of conception are deeply offended by advocacy of abortion rights. On the other hand, there are many solid feminists who believe that opposing abortion rights is to enslave women. They find that perspective deeply offensive. We can't stifle these vital debates.
Is there a slight mismatch, perhaps, between the way that we treat Muslim sensitivities and the way that we treat Christian sensitivities. Perhaps we feel, as societies, both in the UK and in the US, that Christian society is slightly more robust. That, a cartoon that's deeply offensive that might picture the Pope or Jesus in a certain scenario is more acceptable than a similar cartoon about the Prophet Muhammad.
Well, certainly that double standard has been enforced throughout European countries, including the UK. When you look at how the anti-hate speech laws have been enforced, many Christian ministers have been criminally convicted just for preaching from the Bible. And Europe also has these so-called Holocaust denial laws, which say that you can't criticize any aspect of history about the Holocaust. And some have even been enforced that you can't even criticize any current policy of the Israeli government, because that is anti-Semitism. So again, there's a real danger in taking ideas, even ideas that are important to religion, especially those ideas, off the table, because they have a big impact on public policy. And I would say, yes, you should not discriminate in employment or housing or voting or any of the aspects of actual life against religious minorities. The majority is not likely to be discriminated against. But if they are to be members of our society, they have to understand that their views are not beyond criticism. And by the way, it's so interesting that imams and other Muslims feel completely free to strongly criticize other religions, right? So there has to be some parity there.
And you feel like there isn't really, that there is actually, there has become a mismatch in this, because the media may be to blame for this, because we are actually perpetuating these sensitivities.
And there has unfortunately been a claim that to discriminate or to criticize certain religious beliefs, some governments and some courts have enforced hate speech laws to say that is tantamount to saying something hateful about the group of people who hold those beliefs. And that is completely dangerous, because while individuals should not be subject to discriminatory treatment, the fact that they hold certain ideas, that's something that is subject to criticism, unless we are to reenact, in effect, blasphemy laws all over Europe.
I want to touch now on another area where it seems that there is something of a mismatch. And I'm going to start with a quote, actually. This is also in your book, from Kay Sue Park, who talks about speech being a luxury of class. I just wonder how much you feel that, well, the class is completely racialized in America for a start, but also how much is that true, that actually you have more agency if you're more articulate and if you are wealthier. So actually, we're looking at a situation here where you can buy greater influence because of where you came from.
That point used to be a lot more valid before the advent of the internet. And one of the reasons why my organization, the ACLU, went to the Supreme Court to uphold freedom of speech for the internet when it was brand new was not only because of free speech concerns, but also because of equality concerns. We saw this as the most equalizing, democratizing platform, which it certainly has been. Now, to be sure, you have to have certain basic access to technical resources. You have to have certain educational attainments. But we have seen how vast social movements have taken off among very young people, people who are not particularly educated, people who don't hold powerful positions. So on university campuses, for example, the power really has shifted to any individual, including a student who makes a complaint against a faculty member. We see, this is kind of veering off into a different topic, but anybody who is accused of sexual misconduct, which, by the way, it is related to hate speech insofar as even accusing somebody of saying something that relates to sexuality or gender that makes that individual complainant uncomfortable, or or that they find unwelcome has been a ground to summarily fire even tenured faculty members. So the power really belongs basically to anybody who knows how to use social media.
I wonder, does that worry you?
It does worry me. I mean, I am completely committed to reinforcing true equal access to the tools of communication for everybody, no matter who you are in terms of all the criteria we've been talking about, gender, race, religion, majority, minority, but also regardless of what you believe. You should have the opportunity to try to, first of all, to express yourself, which is a big aspect of liberty and autonomy. Secondly, to try to persuade other people, including government officials. That's essential in a democracy. And other people and you should be free to ignore, refute, argue back against ideas that you disagree with.
Another area where I think there may be a mismatch here is in the response to protests. So we've talked about how everybody has the right to protest. But if I go back to the US examples and you look at, for example, how protesters were treated in Ferguson in the US when they were campaigning for Black Lives Matter against the police there, really, for the way that they'd treated black teenagers. And then you look at the way that the police acted in Charlottesville, you can see that although both sides in this were demonstrating and using that free speech, they weren't treated in the same way by the authorities.
There are so many examples where the authorities have not done what they have a constitutional obligation to do. And that is, first of all, to protect safety for everybody. That is first and foremost. We have this famous patriot in the U.S., Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." I completely disagree with that. I don't think after I'm dead I can exercise my liberty. And there has been a failure of law enforcement, in Charlottesville being the most notorious example. But there also has to be protection in such a way that suppresses speech only as a last resort if safety cannot be guaranteed in any way other than silencing the speaker. So keeping the protesters and counter-protesters separate from each other and so forth. Another way that law enforcement has failed is when people have engaged, counter-demonstrators have engaged in violence and actually shouted down and violently disrupted speakers. I think a very well-known example was at a very prestigious college called Middlebury College, where there was a controversial, although academically respected speaker. The students and faculty members who were protesting actually physically attacked and resulted in the hospitalization of a faculty member who was his inviter. And there was no punishment of any of those who engaged in violence and physical attacks. And that's been true on other campuses as well. And so I agree with your premise that we have to have neutral, equal, consistent law enforcement for protesters, counter-protesters, speakers, and those who question the speaker all across the board.
What comes across to me quite strongly, Nadine, is that I feel like you have quite an optimistic view of humankind, if you will. The idea that if we all have the right, if we have access to all the facts, we will make the right-minded decision, that we will be more tolerant, that we will be more open-minded. Do you think that you do just have a kind of an optimistic, upbeat view of human nature?
That is partially correct, Andrea. You can't be an activist without being an optimist. So it's part of the explanation for my stance on these issues. The other part is a little bit more skeptical. It's what is the lesser of two evils? To trust my fellow human beings, at least in the long run, overall, most people are leading, accepting beliefs that are promoting truth and justice and liberty and equality and other good things. Would I rather trust them Or would I rather trust the government to exercise power to pick and choose which ideas are safe and which are not safe? And I distrust the government more than I distrust my fellow human beings. Yes, I'm saying because, the founders of the United States talked about the tyranny of the majority. And so, by the way, did John Stuart Mill in his famous essay on liberty, can be as suppressive and as coercive against individual liberty as the most outrageous unelected tyrant can be. In fact, Mill was more concerned. That whole essay was about social pressure, not government coercion.
Where would you say we are at the moment? Are you more concerned about what's going on in the United States now than you have been for a while? Or do you think that actually this resurgence in activism may have some positives?
It definitely has some positives. So the ACLU, as an example, was just the subject of a cover story in the New York Times magazine as exemplifying people's overwhelming response to Trump's election by not only pouring unprecedented amounts of money into organizations that are devoted to standing up for civil liberties, but also wanting to become activists themselves. So we have so many resources in terms of people of every sort. Lawyers who say, I want to voluntarily take cases, don't pay me, to defend people who are being threatened with deportation. Or we have journalists who are saying, I want to participate in writing materials that can persuade people. So the backlash has been enormous. And I hasten to add, I'm not making partisan statements here. I'm simply talking about policies that violate civil liberties. The ACLU is a neutral, nonpartisan organization.
That's the American Civil
Liberties Union.
Indeed, yeah.
And certainly when Obama was president, there were many of his policies, including in the immigration area, that we were criticizing as well. In some ways, when you have somebody who is seen as so evil and so dangerous, it's helpful because we always know, those of us who are in the trenches, that everybody who's elected poses some threats. And the more visible the threats become, the easier it is to organize against them. And I will say, though, one real concern is the federal courts, starting with the U.S. Supreme Court. We are not going to be able to count on that as an ultimate backstop for our rights to the extent we have been in the recent past.
And very interestingly, that may go on for a generation. I think it's quite difficult for people in the UK to realise that actually those appointments are for life and they can go on for, 25, 30 years?
Oh, more than that. So the president's impact is far, even if he or she is elected for 2 terms, that's a maximum of 8 years. And I think average judges have been staying on the Supreme Court more like 30 years.
We've been discussing, obviously, the challenges surrounding free speech, and the internet has been a game changer in many aspects of our lives. Do you think that the internet does pose unique challenges when it comes to free speech, or are they the challenges that we anticipate and deal with everywhere else, and they're just online? How is it changing?
Every time a new medium has been invented, people who are advocates of free speech and human rights are always celebrating because this is a new and faster and easier and cheaper way to disseminate information. And isn't that wonderful? And people who have a less positive view about free speech and its benefits are always worried about that means that it's going to be easier to spread bad ideas or dangerous ideas. So every new medium in the United States throughout history has always been greeted with attempts to censor it. The internet was no exception. And it's so interesting that when it first hit the political radar screen in the United States, and I have to say the media radar screen, there was enormous panic. I mean, mainstream media were doing nothing but touting the potential dangers to children in terms of violence in the United States, we always have this moral panic about sex. And so, not surprisingly, Congress's first response to the internet was to pass a law censoring specifically patently offensive or indecent expression, which basically is anything to do with sexuality. And ACLU immediately challenged, and that law, almost nobody voted against it, either of the major parties. It was supported by the Bill Clinton administration, a Democratic, supposedly liberal administration, just to underscore how scared people were. And our clients, when we challenged it, included Planned Parenthood, Human Rights Watch. We were one of the plaintiffs because even having information about censorship of sexual topics, giving information about contraception, giving information about sexual abuse, all of this would have been suppressed if we had lost that case.
This is when you were with the American
I
Civil
was
Liberties
head of the
Union and you were running
ACLU.
that. Yeah.
And we won that case challenging this censorial law 9-0 in 1997, and the internet would have been a far different medium if we had not. Now, of course, as with any medium, it's only a medium. It's a means for communicating, and what is actually communicated depends on those of us who use it.
Okay, well, let me put to you a very well-rehearsed argument that I'm sure you've heard before, but I'd be interested to hear your take on it. And it's this idea that people online have an alter ego. They don't say things that they would say across the room to you. So whether it's sexist, whether it's Islamophobic, or just pure vile, they will say things that they wouldn't say in another arena. Do you think that that is true, or do you think that perhaps we are being quite easily offended about this? And actually, they might well say that to their friends. It's just that you're not there when they're saying it.
Exactly. And if somebody has a nasty idea, I would rather know about it than not know about it for a number of reasons. One, so that I can monitor, and if it's a threatening idea, that I would want even government officials to be aware, to monitor that it doesn't erupt into some kind of conduct.
Idea.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I certainly would like to have the opportunity to try to refute that idea. And I should also say that there is a deterrent to expressing yourself online because there are ways to pierce the anonymity, as we've discovered. And we've also discovered the enormous punitive pushback against people who have been heard or learned to have said something discriminatory. The mob descends upon them and destroys their jobs and their careers and their lives.
Do you think it is true that we behave worse online, that people say things that they wouldn't say otherwise?
I don't. I think the jury is out on that. And even if it's true, it becomes easier to respond to those ideas online than it is in the offline world. So in my book, I discuss some really interesting and to me inspiring projects that have been undertaken by social media companies in conjunction with academic experts, where they are able to study counter speech, debates against hateful ideas online. And because it's so easy to gather the information, they can study what kinds of counter speech are most effective in refuting the ideas, not only so that they don't persuade listeners, but also to wean away the hate mongers themselves. And there have just been such inspiring examples of even people who were founders and leaders of hate groups being interceded online with people who have compassion and patience and engage with them and have turned them around. My book mentions one example, a man named Christian Picciolini, who actually, as a result of this intervention and change of heart, founded an organization called Life After Hate. And he's recruited hundreds of people away from hate groups, and each of them, in turn, is doing likewise. So there are ripple effects.
That really is an interesting idea. Do you think that it's something that could be expanded?
Absolutely. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. But, you know, it's one of those ideas that it's nice to have validated by social scientists, but actually it comports with common sense, that it's more effective not to prosecute somebody, as would happen under a hate speech law, or to denounce them as a racist and dismiss them in essence from the human community, but rather to criticize the idea, but not so condemn the idea, but not the speaker. Reach out to as one human being to another.
Now, of course, the laws here in the UK are rather different, and actually you can go to jail for things that you've said online. And we have a few cases that are like that at the moment, where, for example, if you teach your dog to do a Nazi salute. Yeah.
That has gotten publicity all around the world, I assure you.
So tell me your views on that.
I mean, that seems like a ridiculous idea, and the fact that somebody can be punished for something that is at worst misguided, at best an attempt at humor or satire. I don't understand what good is accomplished in combating actual fascistic ideas by using what is a rather fascistic technique to engage in punitive censorship. Noam Chomsky, who's a great intellectual figure in the United States, himself a Jew, said, it's a very odd way to pay tribute to the victims of the Holocaust, to embrace one of the major techniques of their exterminators, namely censorship.
I'd like to turn now to social media companies and the way that they are dealing with hate speech online. They often get an awful lot of criticism for the fact that they say, look, we're just publishers, we're not really involved in the content, and therefore anything can be said. And yet, actually, Facebook has banned some neo-Nazi sort of activists. Britain First is a movement in the UK that's being banned. What do you think of the idea of Facebook banning movements?
Well, first of all, I have to say, as a matter of American First Amendment free speech law, they can do whatever they want because the First Amendment only pertains to the government. If you're in the private sector, you have your own free speech rights, and you can exercise those to say, I'm not going to allow certain ideas to be carried on my platform. However, I would strongly urge the social media, including Facebook, not to use that power, rather to treat it as a neutral platform, the way we've treated in the United States landline telephone companies. So the company cannot be liable for any message that a third party puts on it.
It's a very difficult concept when you think that, for example, in Myanmar, people say that the Rohingyas, the Muslim minority there, a lot of the hate that they attracted grew up through Facebook.
I think
there's an awful lot of posts about them. It created an atmosphere where people were accusing them of crimes, and it led to violence.
You're giving me a really good opportunity to make a basic point, which is, and I made it earlier, but I'll repeat it in this context, which is an idea should not be suppressed merely because of dislike of the idea, no matter how horrific the idea is. But if in a particular context, that idea, that expression directly causes or directly threatens certain specific imminent serious harm that can't be prevented in another way, then definitely you have to suppress it. And Myanmar is a perfect example of that, given the realities on the ground there and the content of the speech as well as the context. It could very well be predicted that, sadly, the violence that occurred did occur. But that's not the same thing as what's occurring, for example, in Germany when its new internet censorship law went into effect January 1st, 2018. The first things that Facebook took off were statements by leaders of the AfD party. Now, we may absolutely despise their speech, but this is a party that got almost 13% of the vote.
This is the far-right party in Germany who recently did very well in the elections.
And of course, it's really important for people to hear their ideas. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the very next thing that was taken offline by Facebook was a magazine that was a satirical magazine that was ridiculing and mocking the discriminatory ideas of the AfD. So, it all depends on the details. And I think Facebook, unfortunately, again, civil rights and civil liberties protesters have said that Facebook is enforcing its hate speech policies to take down their messages. including Black Lives Matter messages, including Native American protesters against the pipeline and other protesters against social injustice.
So really it can be quite counterproductive because actually it does look as if people's voices are being squashed. And in a way that can sometimes generate its own publicity and allow people who are marginalised to get some traction.
The basic problem here, no matter who enforces it, whether it be Facebook or a university or a government official, is that the concept is inherently, irreducibly subjective. One person's hate speech is somebody else's cherished, beloved speech, and we cannot entrust anybody else to make those decisions for us.
What do you feel is the future of freedom of speech online?
I'm very optimistic because I think that there is such pressure now to correct the missteps in both directions. So there's been justified criticism against Facebook for not sufficiently taking down the dangerous, threatening, inciting expression that has led to the persecution of the Rohingya in Myanmar. But on the other hand, there has been pushback by racial justice activists and feminists, among others, because Facebook has disproportionately discriminated against their messages. And I think it's responsive to consumer pressure. And I'm hopeful that either the Facebooks of the world will veer toward an appropriate distinction between punishable and protected speech, or if not, that other companies will emerge that will do so and win out in the economic marketplace.
Thank you very much indeed.
The Rathbones Look Forward series.